glad you could come.
I'm glad to be here.
I'm Swanee Hunt, and I direct the Women in Public Policy program at the Kennedy School. Thank you all very much for being here to discuss an extremely important public policy issue. We're calling this day Stolen Lives, the Trafficking and Exploitation of Women. It's a grim subject, but you know, it's so important. I often think that when my grandchildren say to me one day, where were you when? The end of that sentence may be, where were you when the whole scale ramp up of the abuse and slavery of women took off. So it's important that you're here. Now we're obviously set up for a conversation rather than a speech. And we have with us Donna Hughes, who is the professor and chair at the Women's Studies program at the University of Rhode Island. She does research and writing on and for women's rights. She's frequently consulted by governments and non-governmental organizations on policy related to women's human rights, particularly trafficking and sexual exploitation. And Ambassador Miller just told me a couple of minutes ago that when he took his job heading up this effort for the State Department, that Donna Hughes was the person who was emailing him night and day with information that was vital to his work. Her research has been supported by the US State Department, the National Institute of Justice, Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, International Organization for Migration, Council of Europe. You get the picture. Thank you very much for coming.
Happy to be here.
Good. Next to Donna is Assistant Secretary General for Mission Support in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, Jane Hall-Lute. I met Jane for the first time when she was at the National Security Council working on Europe. She was a major in the Army. And following that, she went to the Carnegie Commission for the Carnegie Corporation, where David Hamburg had a special project on the prevention of deadly conflict. And he asked Jane to come and steer that ship. Very, very important work. Frankly, it's hard for us in this audience to remember a time when preventing deadly conflict wasn't part of the mindset, but there actually was that time. And over years, it changed because of the leadership of Jane. She also had a stint as the #2 at the UN Foundation, which was set up with much fanfare when Ted Turner announced that he would give $1 billion to supporting the work of the UN. And now she is heading up the task force. Jane, what is it called actually?
It's the Task Force on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse.
For the UN. And am I right that this stemmed from the scandal in the Congo, in DRC? So she'll be talking some more about that work and what she's trying to do through the UN. She's sitting next to John Miller. Full disclosure, he's my cousin. But in addition, he's the director of the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. And he has been a senior advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell, and I assume now Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, related to human trafficking. This office coordinates the US government activity in the global fight against modern-day slavery, which includes forced labor and sexual exploitation, impacting some 800,000 women, children, and men every year, but the great preponderance of that being women and children. Before that, in different parts of his career, he served as a congressman, a Republican congressman from Seattle. and he held a seat on the House Committee on International Relations and also was a member of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. Now, not here on stage with us is Anuradha Koirala, who is the founder and executive director of Mighty Nepal. And she tried to be here, but as she was getting on the plane, she became ill and ended up in a hospital. Anuradha was born in Nepal and has been here speaking to us before. She is a former professor of English and started this NGO with her own savings in a small house in Kathmandu, where she would bring in women who were being trafficked, women and girls, as a shelter. She's a widely recognized activist and lecturer who has dedicated her life to combating the sexual exploitation of women and children. And she's received many awards, such as the Reebok Human Rights Award and the World Children's Prize from the International Children's Organization of Sweden. 10 years into her crusade to stop trafficking in the Nepal region, she oversees an organization with 150 employees. Since she could not be here today, we looked at a film that features her, and we'd like to begin our conversation today with a 5-minute clip so that you all can have a sense of her presence.
Escaping that darkness remains a dream for most because of the immense profits at stake. Profits that increase every time a child is raped. Conservatively, if each of Bombay's 200,000 prostitutes service 5 clients a day at $2 a transaction, that's at least $2 million changing hands every day. $700 million a year in Bombay alone.
$700 million. This is one brothel area. That doesn't include Delhi, Calcutta, Madras. The amount of crime associated with this is probably equal, if not exceeding, the drug trade. There are actual locations for which they are hubs for trafficked girls to be brought to. It's almost like a slave trade spot where people go and say, I'll take this one, I'll take this one, I'll take this one, and they negotiate the price. It's very, very systematic.
A multi-billion-dollar industry with children as the commodity being bought and sold. Recruiters who scout them, traffickers who deceive them, the pimps and the madams who buy them, and the police with their hands out and their eyes closed.
Nepal and India has open border, which is 1,500 kilometers long, and there is just 26 official points, which means there are police, there are customs, but there are so many 2,600 points where trafficker can take the girls to India.
If we want to fight this entire system of child exploitation, we have to do it by creating a system of safety. We have to create our own network, which would block the system off at each and every stage.
The brothel keepers wake up every single day committed to their work. They wake up very focused about what it is that they're doing, and they're there all day, every day, 24/7. And somebody has to have the same sort of commitment to fighting the problem. So this is going to be a determination about who is more committed at the end of the day.
Each child, what's going to happen? What will happen to them? I feel, like it really scares me. But then it gives me encouragement. I must do something. I must stop it.
We have altogether 4 girls working for us as border guards. They are working together in collaboration with the police and the municipality. The ones who are being trafficked to India for prostitution, they stop because they, as I told you, they are themselves the survivors and they know the way of trafficking. So they know how to stop girls from entering into India.
We've been successful to intercept more than 300 girls. From one point, within a year,
मेरो नाम निशा हो र मेरो बुटल हो म 9 वर्ष हुँदाखेरि उता लिएर गएँ हामीले अब बिहान 6 बज्न अगाडि नै जान्छौँ 6 बजे पुग्छौँ त्यहाँ बसेर अब सबै रिक्साहरूलाई चेक गर्नुपर्छ गाडीहरूलाई चेक गर्नुपर्छ अनि शङ्खलाकोलाई सोध्छौँ अब अनि शङ्खला सोध्ने अब हो रहेछ भने राख्ने होइन रहेछ भने राख्दैनौँ
केटी बेच्छ भने थाहा छ
मैले बेचेको छैन
बट्टा कुरा बोलेर जे गरेर पनि हुन्छ यस्तो काम गर्नु राम्रो हुन्छ त हुँदैन
Your daughter, if you find a person who has trafficked your daughter, what would you first do? He said, I will kill him if he traffics my daughter. So I said, but why did you traffic? And he was answerless. First, you have to learn to take them as your own child. Then you will feel the sorrow, and then the strength comes out from you to protect them, to take care of them.
हेर न मलाई हेरेर भने भइहाल्छ नि किन डराउनु पर्यो न त हामी तिमीलाई मार्दैनौँ तिमीलाई खाँदैनौँ म खानु पनि सक्दिनँ तिमीलाई मार्नु पनि सक्दिनँ जान्नुहुन्छ भने उहाँले निकालिदिन्छ है तिमी मेरोमा आउने तिम्रो आमालाई खोजेर तिम्रो आमा बाबु छैन भने पनि हाम्रो घर छ हाम्रो घरमा बसेर तिमी गर्ने
या खराब होने के बजाय ये लोग बीमारी पकड़ लेगी फिर खराब हो जाएंगे ये भी लोग छोड़ देंगे आपको तो ये जो है ये महिला आई
ये किसी का दबाव भी आपने कोई तुम्हारे घर वाले मालकिन बिल्किन कुछ बोलेगी ऐसा मत सोचो सबके सामने अगर आपको कुछ बोलना है तो इमीडिएटली बोलो बाबा जाने का है यहाँ से निकलने का है जो भी है जल्दी बोलो
मारे के बच्चे के दीदी इधर है वहाँ से
10,000 रुपये पैसा दिन्छ एउटा मिसिन दिन्छ अनि तिमीलाई घर पठाउँछौँ अनि घरमा गएर तिमीले के काम गरेर खानुपर्छ
अरे माँ बाप नहीं है तो माँ बाप मिल जाएंगे
माँ तो मायके ने पाने तो माँ भी है बाप भी है
सामान है बाबा का सामान है पिताजी मम्मी का सामान है
These girls are betrayed. They need love and care. So, where do you get love and care? Where you get protection? So the only place is mother's home.
And the Women in Public Policy program will be showing the day My God Died on Monday, March 7th at 6:30 in the Wiener Auditorium. That's 6:30 in the evening. And we do expect that Anuradha will be with us for that. Now, the questions that we'd like to put to you all as our guests for this discussion are three. The first is, what are the societal and human toll? What is the societal and human toll of trafficking and sexual exploitation? Does it really make a difference to us as a society or to other societies? How are the police and military involved? And third, what strategies are effective in the war against trafficking and sexual exploitation? And it doesn't matter to me how you want to engage with each other. So I'm going to just lay it out there and let you all mull it over, and whoever wants to start speaking, please do. And after about 20 minutes of conversation up here, 20 or 30 minutes, we'll open it up to you all for questions from the audience. Okay?
Yeah, I'd like to start with something, and I think we'll get into more detail this towards the end of our discussion. But you, in your introduction, you said that this was a grim subject, and it really is. And I started doing anti-trafficking work 15 years ago, and I think I've learned every day since then. I have learned something, and most of it's terrible about what is happening to victims. But you said, where were you? Asked that question. One of the things I can say now, which I couldn't say even 5 years ago, is there is tremendous opportunity to get involved and make a difference. If you've ever read about the abolitionists before the Civil War and think, boy, if I lived at that time, I'd have been an abolitionist. Or if you think about women's rights and said, boy, if I'd lived in 1915, I'd have been a suffragette. Well, now is a time in history in which you can get involved and you can get in, and you can help win that kind of a battle.
And why?
So anything,
why is it
so that all the terrible things you're going to hear, you can help do something tomorrow.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. So the good news is that we shouldn't feel helpless.
That's right.
very important
Absolutely.
before we get into these
Absolutely.
details. But why should we even care? I mean, what's going on? First of all, what is this problem? What's it look like out there? Give us a baseline here.
Well, you talked about the toll. Our estimates are that 800,000 men, women, and children are trafficked across international borders into slavery every year. That's across international borders. That doesn't count internal slavery, multiple years. You're talking millions. And the categories of slavery, sex slavery, domestic servitude slavery, factory slavery, farm slavery, child soldier slavery, all kinds of slavery. It comes as a shock to people. Many Americans still say, didn't slavery end with the American Civil War? But I think there's a reaction in many countries. Now, what does this mean in terms of the toll? Why should we be concerned? I think it poses three challenges. The first, of course, is the obvious one, the challenge, the affront to human dignity and human rights. You can cite figures, but if you have talked to victims around the world, as I have done, you talk to Katya in the Czech Republic, who spent years enslaved in a brothel in Amsterdam. Talk to Lord in Bangkok, who spent years in an embroidery factory, 12, 13-year-old girl, beaten, industrial chemicals dumped on her. You talk to Tina, came from a rural village in Indonesia and ended up working as a domestic slave in Malaysia. You start to hear these stories, you realize the affront to human rights, but there's other tolls on society. There's the public health toll. I think the public health implications are pretty obvious in all kinds of slavery, but obviously with sex slavery, particularly HIV/AIDS. And then there's the toll for national stability and security. And why do I say that? Because in this day and age, when we talk about slavery, particularly sex slavery, we are talking about organized crime. We have reached the point where Interpol, the FBI, they talk about major sources of revenue for organized crime, and they talk about the drug trade, the arms trade, and the people trade. And so in many of the societies, if you have organized crime flourishing, you have a challenge to stability. I'm just taking your question, why we should be concerned. Let others, we can keep going on the discussion, more questions.
Before you move on, you mentioned Katya. I mean, how do women end up at brothels in Amsterdam, in the red light district? I mean, isn't this an economic decision that they're making? Could you tell us about Katya?
Well, I think there are those that would claim it's an economic decision, but let's take Katya as an example. When I met Katya, she was in her late 20s, working in a hospital, studying for a degree in social work. And Katya told me the story of how she came from the Czech Republic to Amsterdam. She was a teenager at the time, 17 or 18 years old. She had a failing marriage. She had a 2-year-old daughter. And a friend of the family that was no friend said, oh, I know where you can start a new life. I know where you can make money. You can wait on tables in Amsterdam. And so Katya said, all right. The friend introduces her to the Czech trafficker. The Czech trafficker drives Katya and 3 or 4 other young women to Amsterdam, links up with the Dutch trafficker. They seize their papers, their passports, take Katya to a brothel and say, Katya, this is where you're going to be working. And Katya says, no, I came to work in a restaurant, to wait on tables. You owe us X thousand euros for getting you here. You will work here. Katya says, no, I won't. Yes, you will if you want your 2-year-old daughter back in the Czech Republic to live. And so she did. Now, of course, economics may propel Katya's decision. Encourage her to fall victim to the deception. Or if in a different case, maybe has an inkling but thinks, oh, it isn't going to be so bad. Of course, economics are a factor. But there are a lot of other factors. There's, along with the push factor of poverty, there's the pull factor of the material life. There's the attitudes towards gender that leads to the demand for most slavery, and there's the greed and organized crime factor. All of these come together, I think, to create this 21st century human rights challenge.
Well, it seems to me you can slice this different ways. You can say that trafficking in women is one subset of the whole slavery issue, or you can say the trafficking in women is one example of exploitation against women that goes beyond trafficking to a lot of other cases. And that's what you're working on, Jane, through the UN, you're not working on trafficking, but you're working on sexual exploitation. Could you describe how that came about and what you're doing?
The task force that I chair is within the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and relates directly to the allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse against UN peacekeepers. I co-chair a system-wide task force with our colleagues from the humanitarian community also on this subject, which is abuse at the hands of UN personnel, either civilian or military. This is not my area of expertise, it's not my background. So it's very interesting when you come fresh to a subject like this, and what you learn is there is no international standard. 60 Minutes ran a show 2 weeks ago, showed 5 or 6 American servicewomen who had been raped and abused by fellow servicemen. This is in the United States. The United Nations peacekeepers who owe a duty of care to the people not only of the Congo, but of every mission we serve, 17 places around the world and an additional 16 special political missions. We owe a duty of care to the people that we've served, and we fundamentally have violated that duty of care. The world hasn't come as far as you would like to think in its attitudes towards women.
And the task force, what is your goal?
Fundamentally, the goal of the task force is to put meaning behind the phrase zero tolerance. We're not naive. We don't suspect that this behavior will be, erase itself overnight. But through a combination of measures in mission areas, at headquarters, and together with the member states, what we're organizing is a comprehensive approach and a determined effort to restore the luster to the blue helmet. Which is, as I've said before, has become black and blue through the self-inflicted wound of bad behavior ranging to crime and the exploitation of children. And it's unfortunate in the past, UN officials have been quoted as saying, boys will be boys. Boys are not boys when they attack defenseless women. Boys are not boys when they rape 13-year-olds. And boys are not boys when they take a poor, innocent child and destroy that life in future. I mean, there's a word for these kind of people, but boys ain't it. And I think fundamentally our task force is going to take this to heart, take the issue to the heart of the UN and ask ourselves, how do we look ourselves in the eye if this continues to happen among our ranks?
Well, one of the things that I would say as far as the impact this has is, of course, the primary person that suffers is the victim. And I work on sex trafficking rather than other forms of trafficking, so that's what I will refer to, and I'll refer to victims as she, although there are boys and some men who are victims of sex trafficking as well. The first thing that a victim of sex trafficking loses, of course, is their freedom. And immediately they are stripped then of their dignity, as John Miller said, and their integrity, their bodily integrity. And then they are subjected to long bouts of violence, physical violence, sexual violence, depredation, just about anything you can do to a human being to make them submit. That's what these victims are, what happens to these victims. They suffer a tremendous amount of trauma, physical trauma from the violence, as well as psychological trauma. They end up with post-traumatic stress disorder. They're depressed. They feel hopeless. And for many victims, the only recourse is suicide. And we know that there's a very high suicide rate among victims who are not able to escape, or they become so hopeless the idea of escape is impossible for them. Another societal cost of this, as John Miller mentioned, in association of organized crime, or the involvement of organized crime in this, is the rule of law. In countries where there is rule of law, that is compromised when there is significant amount of trafficking, because one of the things that is most needed for trafficking to succeed, and that is corruption. The involvement of police, military, government officials, all must, maybe not all of them, but almost at every level, some official of the government and police have to be involved. Either that or it's found out very quickly and something is done about it. And then when you have the rule of law and justice compromised like that, all of society suffers. Certainly the victims lose any hope that the police will help them or that there is anyone out there that will help them. And when you live in a community in which the rule of law has been compromised, the whole society soon sees who is corrupt and loses all faith in the system as well.
You know, I was just in Sudan, and I was meeting with a couple of women from Khartoum who are working in the IDP camps. And they said the women are really getting to have a loud voice protesting about safety. And I said, so they're wanting more police? She said, no, they want the police out of the camps because the police are raping the women who already have been displaced from their homes. And I tried to imagine that, where you turn to your protector and instead he becomes the perpetrator. And it is a shattering thought. We better move into what's being done about this, because I'm feeling pretty bad right now. Okay? John, anyone, Jane, Donna?
Well, the picture is not hopeless. I mean, in the last several years, we've seen increasing public awareness, which is the start of good action. You've had our government take the lead with the Congress and the President pushing so that you now have an annual report that looks at what goes on around the world on this issue.
And anyone who would like to have these
where there's even the potential of sanctions if a country does poorly. An assessment, by the way, there's also a report on the United States and what we're doing and what we could do better, because slavery extends into every country in the world. Let's make no mistake about it. You now have more programs around the world. President Bush's initiative that he announced at the United Nations a year and a third ago, where the headlines were understandably about Iraq and Afghanistan, but he spent over 20% of his speech on slavery. So you now have a nucleus of protection, prevention, prosecution programs that we're helping around the world. And I think as there's been increased media attention and increased awareness, and you see our embassies putting more pressure on governments, and you see more coordination here, and you see more NGOs, the faith-based and feminist NGOs who've taken the lead on this, do more. You see signs of progress. I'll give you a few. This past year, there were almost 3,000 convictions of traffickers worldwide. I mean, several years ago, the figure wouldn't have even been a few hundred. This past year, the past 2 years, you've had almost 50 countries adopt comprehensive anti-trafficking in person laws with punishments and provisions for protection. You've seen hundreds of shelters set up. These are the signs of progress, but so much more needs to be done. I mean, when we describe this problem, well, I don't want to say that nothing's been done. Things are being done, but so much more needs to be done, because when you hear the stories that we're talking about, I mean, if we talk about extending freedom to the world, there's nothing more basic than freedom from slavery. I mean, we've suffered the stain of slavery. If we talk about women's emancipation, it's very appropriate that you're sponsoring this here, because our figures show 70 to 80% of the victims are the female gender. But if you talk about women's emancipation, we can talk about a whole range of issues, but what is more basic than emancipation from slavery? I mean, that is really at the core. So there's a lot more to be done.
John, when you talk about having gone from a few hundred to 3,000, how does that compare, though, with the rise in the numbers of women being actually trafficked?
Yeah.
I mean, is it like we are gaining ground, or are we losing ground?
This is a very hard question to answer. The reason it's hard to answer is victims don't stand in line and raise their hands to be counted, as we all know. So what we don't have a good measurement on is whether these figures that are being quoted, the 800,000 that you and I cited, has gone up or gone down. I think this was rising over the last 20 years, and I think we're starting to turn the corner. But it is very hard to scientifically prove this.
What's your sense, Donna?
I agree. The two things that I would point to that really, as John said, sort of got us to turn the corner was in the year 2000, the United Nations added a protocol on trafficking to their Convention Against Organized Crime. And countries started signing and ratifying that. And I think that really set an international or universal definition of trafficking and a standard, so that when countries were involved in drafting laws, they could look to this as a model to how to define trafficking and help them along in passing new laws. Also in the year 2000, here in the United States, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed. And that has provided a number of grants and trainings inside the United States to help provide services to victims and help law enforcement find victims here. But one of the things that it did is having a huge global impact is this TIP report. And this was actually a controversial provision in the TVPA in 2000.
Sorry, TIP being the trafficking
in persons.
Yeah,
trafficking in persons. And the controversial provision was, it said that based on this report, in which countries are divided into 3 tiers, the United States will threaten to withhold non-humanitarian aid to those countries. And that was quite controversial, and a lot of people didn't want to put that in. And yet, I think that has been a very successful tool in giving people like John Miller has enabled him to then go out and talk to these talk to other diplomats and other governments and put pressure on them. And I think that there is a tremendous amount of progress being made globally because of this tip report.
Is there anything similar that could be useful at the UN, Jane?
The conversation really emphasizes that UN abuse is not happening in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And I would make a broader argument, in fact. Sexual exploitation and abuse does not itself occur in a vacuum. We've talked a little bit about the organized crime setting, but you can talk about the broader environment of indiscipline as well. I mean, whenever a UN peacekeeping mission goes into an area, you're bringing power and wealth into a broken society. There is by nature a risk that you're running here. But we know this, and we should fully be able to anticipate that risk and respond accordingly with the proper policies, procedures, and enforcements that exist. Why hasn't that worked in the past? For several reasons, I think. One, because we know at the UN represents the world's aspirations as much as anything else, and so a lot of hope is placed in the UN, and so over the course of the past 15 years, there have been periods of great surge in peacekeeping missions sent out around the world. We're experiencing a surge right now. And every time we have had a surge in the past, we have had problems like this arise. Whenever you grow very quickly, very fast, you run risks and you pay a price. And this is part of the price we have paid. If we know that, how come we haven't done anything about it in the past? Well, in fact, we have. We have strengthened the definitions and understandings of what constitutes sexual exploitation and abuse. And in fact, the Secretary General's bulletin issued in 2003 details the code of conduct. You would say, well, a code of conduct detailed in 2003, what the heck happened? Why wasn't that done before? Well, we might ask ourselves the same question about why it's only now that the Uniform Code of Military Justice governing United States military forces outlaws prostitution. Just now, they're working on that. So, I mean, there is a legitimate question of timing, but it's not one that's purely in this context. In addition, what we have learned is that words are not enough. You need to back them up. And the UN has limited authority in this regard, and we rely together on the member states to help us, and we can talk about that if you like. So fundamentally what you need is a suite of measures to be put in place, and it requires a collective effort. It requires the efforts, yes, of the United Nations, yes, of the contributing countries, yes, of the professional militaries around the world, yes, of the populations themselves. Yesterday in my office, 9 Congolese women came and talked to me about the problem of sexual exploitation and abuse, and their fundamental question to me was, how can we help the UN? How can we help the UN? I had to ask them 3 times. How can you help the UN? Yes, how can we help the UN? Because you're receiving a lot of criticism for this right now. And yes, it's very bad, but if the UN leaves, our lives will be immeasurably worse. So how can we help you? I was so ashamed. I was so ashamed. But I recognize that they have a role to play. And so we have to come together to figure out the way out of this swamp.
Yes, John.
Well, Jane has a tremendous challenge, and we talked about this whole problem around the world, that the focus on UN peacekeepers today is because while military and peacekeeping forces traditionally have fueled demand for trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, what has gone on among UN peacekeepers exceeds anything that I know of. This goes back to the Balkans, where UN forces were actually running trafficking rings. It goes into the Congo, where a month or 2 ago, the UN's own investigating team found scores of allegations of rape, UN peacekeepers trading bits of food and $1 or $2 for sex, rapes of children. And the code, the UN has good codes. The Secretary General, as Jane mentioned, has signed off on a good code, but as the UN's own investigative report said, the code, which calls for zero tolerance, but there's been zero compliance with zero tolerance. That's the quote from the UN's own investigative report. When they went to investigate, they had a problem. The UN peacekeepers tried to bribe and threaten them. So, I mean, this is a really serious problem. If we want There are 103 nations that contribute to UN peacekeeping forces. And I think we look ahead in the world, UN peacekeepers, it's the view of certainly the United States and the State Department that UN peacekeepers have a critical role to play. But if UN peacekeepers become known as rapists and traffickers, if that's their reputation, you're going to find the credibility severely damaged, which is why the Secretary of State Powell, one of his last acts in office, and the Foreign Minister of Japan sent a letter to the Secretary General saying, we support what you've done on the code, but there has to be changes in training and discipline. We cannot just have the troop contributing countries, 103 of them, sending troops into the Congo or any place else without training and discipline on this issue. And this is the challenge that Jane is wrestling with now, how to transform the UN peacekeeping culture. It is not an easy challenge.
It's really, really hard because it is all part of this monolithic, very patriarchal structure. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers today, but order of magnitude, there are about 8 women among about 180 permanent reps to the UN, and about 2 SRSG special representatives of the Secretary General out of about 40. And so when you have that enormous imbalance among the decision makers, how do we hope to have a different product at the end? We have brought here to the Kennedy School over the years about 200 women from 35 conflicts. And they come up with, these are not women who are coming as victims, they're coming as actors, and they come up with all kinds of proposals. Now, many of them have been victims, which actually adds strength to their role as actors. And the kinds of proposals they come up with are to change the dynamics at the top, change who gets invited to the negotiating table, change who is in there writing the Constitution, change who is designing the refugee camps and the IDP camps. And it's got to be a thorough change at so many different levels. I'm sounding like one of the panelists
No.
instead of the moderator. Excuse me.
Well, I think of course, the most important thing that it takes to bring about change and to address this is political will. And political will comes about in a number of different ways. One of them can be good leadership. I think that there are a number of people in the U.S. Congress, excuse me, who are known for their leadership on this issue, and they make sure that they made sure that the TVPA got passed, and that there are reauthorizations. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed, and that there are reauthorizations every couple of years when necessary, and are working on new bills right now. I think that President Bush has taken an extraordinary leadership role in speaking out on this particular issue. So that's how leadership can, or you can generate political will at the top, but it can also come up from the bottom through, oh boy, excuse me. Through organizing through civil society. And one of the ways in which trafficking really got before the public eye was through feminist organizations and feminist NGOs that were working with victims or knew about the problem, just kept giving presentations, kept generating awareness until in 2000, like I said, things suddenly tipped and we had both the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the UN Protocol. So you can sort of get political will from the top, or you can find ways of generating it from the grassroots and come up.
But you know, your point on the involvement of women, and I haven't done a scientific survey of this, but I'm going just on my travels around the world, when I deal with other governments, I would say it's a fair statement that the women in government, the women associated with NGOs, do tend to be more interested, more passionate, more concerned about this issue for very understandable reasons. And as they start to put more pressure on their governments, there will be more action.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's open it up to you all. To the mics, there's a mic 1, 2, and 3, 4. And if you'll get yourselves in front of a mic, you have a much better chance of getting to ask a question. We'll begin right over here with you. And would you identify yourself? Make sure that it's a question, not a statement, and keep it brief. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Amanda Dines from the School of Public Health, and I'm a former peacekeeper. I'm very happy to hear about the codes of practice that have been developed, but I wondered how you're going to deal with some of the cultural differences between troop contiguity nations with respect to attitudes towards this issue, and whether the UN is going to have the power or the commitment to refuse certain nations or send certain nations out of an area of operation who don't meet the standard.
Thanks for that question. When John Miller said there are 103 countries contributing to UN peacekeeping, I thought he was talking about in the Congo, because the Congo has about 100 nationalities represented. MONUC, the UN peacekeeping mission in the Congo, has about 100 nationalities represented, 18,000 troops, several thousand civilians. And this is a genuine problem, because in many of the countries that provide peacekeeping soldiers, prostitution, for example, is not outlawed. And in many of the societies where peacekeeping operations are conducted, prostitution is itself not outlawed. And what we're trying to do is establish a UN standard which reflects a universal sensibility regarding the treatment of women, regarding the behavior of soldiers, regarding the treatment of children and underage. So part of the way we're going to do that is we've been in dialogue with the member states. Prince Zayed, who is the permanent representative of Jordan to the United Nations, has been the advisor to the Secretary General in intensive dialogue with the member states about what it is they will do to ensure that this doesn't happen, because just as the United States would retain national control over its military at all times, so do they as well. And there has been talk of a number of initiatives related to this, for example, courts-martial in mission areas, and following through with member states. Morocco, as you may know, has just announced the arrest of 6 peacekeepers. John Miller mentioned that the problem with the UN passes his understanding about the depths of it. I'm not going to sit here silently and let my brothers and sisters, who are noble peacekeepers, who have performed their duties in remarkably remote areas. You know, soldiers go to these places in the world expecting the worst humanity has to offer. Civilians go to these places in the world believing in the best humanity has to offer. Peacekeeping missions represent both. This is an enormously powerful combination and contribution to peace, even in places like the Congo. It is better off than it was 5 years ago in a number of dimensions. Last week, 9 Bangladeshi peacekeepers were killed. 2 days ago, Pakistani soldiers calling in India close air support in response to an attack that was in the wake of Bangladeshi peacekeepers responded decisively in the face of that attack. Only in the UN do you see that kind of collaboration and cooperation between what are ordinarily enemies. So it is not an easy task. It's not simply words on a page, but it is collaboration with the member states to make meaningful the measures taken to ensure that this practice ceases.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kanwar Singh. I'm a master's student here at Kennedy School, and before coming here, I served for 2 years at the mission in Congo, in the administration. When I joined the mission, there was the case of a D1 level person who had impregnated a 16-year-old girl. She came to the office, she slapped the guy and threatened him with death. This guy had to be evacuated the same night, and to date, he's still working in New York headquarters. I have a 2-part question. Why hasn't action been taken against civilians for whom such strong evidence exists? And second, why did it take such a widespread coverage in media before such a commission had to be established?
Give me the details of the case. I don't know it offhand, number one. Number two, it's a fair question. The UN is going to have to account for why it has taken this long to deal decisively with this problem. But even as I said earlier, I mean, our sensibilities have changed even from just a few years ago. I can tell you right now, in the case of MONUC, 8 civilian cases have been referred to headquarters for action. Over 65 people have been expelled from the mission. A number of commanders have been put on notice. This is a new way of doing business for the United Nations because, again, sexual exploitation and abuse doesn't occur in a vacuum. Commanders are creating the kind of environment where good order and discipline have broken down. Civilian leadership have created an environment of permissiveness where these kinds of things occur with impunity. They're going to be held to account because the fundamental work of peacekeepers is good, decent work. And we can't lose sight of that for this problem. So give me that information.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
My name's Missy Allen. Ambassador Miller, you were speaking about the imposition of sanctions, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on any initiatives that the administration has made in imposing sanctions on nations in violation of trafficking.
Well, the purpose of the law that Donna referred to is to get action. And the sanction tool, or more accurately, the threat of sanctions, is a useful tool. For example, a year and a half ago, countries, allies such as Greece and Turkey, were put on the lowest tier. The law is very skillfully drafted. When a country's put on the lowest tier in the June report, they then have 3 months to, so to speak, show significant progress. In the case of Greece and Turkey and 7 or 8 other nations that year, it was amazing after the publicity of this, what happened in the next 3 or 4 months. Arrests, prosecutions, shelters set up, referral systems from police to NGOs, etc. So I think that's an example. This past year you had a country like Bangladesh that had was on the lowest tier. Never had sanctions apply because they took steps. You had a country like Japan, there's now 4 tiers. They were not put in tier 3. They were put in tier 2 watch list, which is saying you're about to go to tier 3. And what's happened, and Japan has a terrible problem, I've got to say. I've been there. I mean, this is a country that issued to the young women of one nation, the Philippines, 55,000, quote, entertainer visas in 1 year. And if you believe that Japan needs 55,000 Filipino entertainers, But after this report came out, the Prime Minister set up a committee. There's now a law that's, First Amendments have been passed in Parliament. So you see some of the results here. Not perfect. There's so much more to do. And
in India?
India is another country that is on, if you look at the report, is on tier 2 watch list, which is just above the tier where they'd be eligible for sanctions. India has a huge problem, as we all know, sex slavery, forced labor slavery, the brick kiln slavery, all kinds of slavery in India. India's got severely chastised for lack of prosecutions. I've got to tell you, the government officials resented the criticism. What right do you have to criticize us? I get that when I go to countries. But the fact is that the number of prosecutions and arrests stepped up in India, went from a handful up into the hundreds in this area. India still doesn't have a national action policy. India's government still lags behind their NGO community, which is incredible. There are so many great NGOs in India setting up shelters and trying to care for victims. It will be interesting to see what happens with India in the June report. But hopefully some good things will happen.
Okay, now, thank you. What I'd like to do now is take about, I would like 5 of you to, I'd like your questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And then I'm going to ask you all to make your notes about these 5 questions and then have a concluding conversation that integrates those. So let's begin. Where did I say? Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Identify yourself first, please.
I'm Christian US. I'm Christian US. Why does the UN run a drug ring in Yugoslavia? Why did the UN run a drug ring in Yugoslavia?
Okay, so it's about the UN's Yugoslav mission and how
Yes.
it fits into all of this. We'll get to that.
Yes, it is. Why the UN runs a drug ring in Yugoslavia, or was anyway.
All right, thank you. Yes.
My name is Sarah Spencer. I'm a master's candidate at the Kennedy School and a humanitarian aid worker by training. My question is to Ambassador Miller and to Dr. Lute about, you spoke a little bit about preventative measures for UN peacekeepers and sexual exploitation. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about response measures to sexual exploitation, and in particular, if you think it will ever be feasible to revise the status of forces agreements between member nations and the U.S., the UN rather, and if the U.S. will ever permit such a revision.
Thank you.
Joni Bronfman, I was involved with the Global Fund Circle on Trafficking. 2 questions. One is there any training for peacekeepers on gender issues? And then a second question was, Donna mentioned that this was an exciting time because there were things that we could do. Tell us about them.
Yes, well, maybe save that for the very end so people feel energized, okay? Yes.
Brigitte Cazalis-Collins, and I am Friends of Mighty Nepal, representative of Mighty Nepal, and very sorry that Anuradha could not be here. I don't have so much a question as saying the following. We always ask the question, what are governments doing throughout the world? What are governments doing? I live in Nepal, work in Nepal, and one question that is not often addressed, so I believe, is what do we do about the people in the villages who, in many cases, are not respecting the girls' or the woman's role? She does not count. As we know, in India or in Nepal or many other countries, if a young girl comes out of the womb, this is a disaster. And no, we don't seem to address that woman does not count, and I'm sorry to say, but in many countries she doesn't, and therefore she's a disposable commodity. I don't know how governments can address this, and I think that, for example, Mighty Nepal has awareness programs. We go out in the countries and we do tell people, how to respect the girls, and I think we should put more energy into that at the grassroots of the people of the village, and the governments can help us do that.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Anahid Martirosyan, and I'm from Armenia. I spent the last 3 years actually drafting annual anti-trafficking report because I worked for U.S. Embassy. And my question here is the following. Ambassador Miller, probably it's for you. We know that sanctions work, and especially in poor countries who are endangered by the idea that sanctions might be cut, they immediately undertake some actions. They do sometimes kind of show programs to impress international community. Sometimes it's effective in terms of work done, sometimes it just show. But what about countries of destination, where women are taking from these poor countries? Armenia is a small country. I mean, we don't have that huge problem with women trafficked abroad. But it's essential for us. And where they are going to some rich countries which don't follow many international norms and rules. I don't want to name the countries where many women from our region go, you know better than me, but these countries don't behave according to international norms. So what's the policy towards these regions? Thank you.
All right, okay, go ahead, one more, since we had a statement rather than a question.
Hi, my name is Asya Trochansky. I'm a student at the college. This is probably for Ambassador Miller. Last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that the Bush administration added another conditionality to private organizations that provide health care for AIDS victims. Now, organizations have to certify in writing that they oppose prostitution. I was wondering what the rationale for this policy was and what the potential repercussions were.
Do you have the person? Okay, very quickly. Yes.
Thank you for asking that question. My name is Kara Hess. I'm an alum, and I currently work in public policy and international development. And we have that restriction has actually been in place for 2 years, where foreign organizations are required to sign a policy stating that they are against prostitution and sex trafficking. And also the legislation or the restriction says that no U.S. funds can be used to promote sex trafficking and prostitution. Which means, as a U.S. organization, we have to enforce these rules and restrictions on our foreign partners. My question, and secondly, we have just learned about a month ago that the Department of Justice said that this restriction, they believe this restriction can be placed on U.S. organizations, which means, organizations like CARE and Save the Children will now be forced to have a policy against prostitution and sex trafficking in order to receive U.S. government funds.
Okay, so now we're seeing the complex web of policies and trying to figure out when we are having unintended consequences that may be more damaging as we're trying to be helpful. Will you all take the last 9 minutes now? And you can address any of these that just resonate with you. John, why don't we maybe start down on your end?
Okay, I'm going to just, there were so many questions, but I think there were two that, or three that were particularly pointed at me. There was a question from a lady from Nepal about educating people in the villages. And I think that's very pertinent, because if you look at what's going on in this fight against trafficking, fight against slavery, trafficking in persons is a euphemism. If you look at what's going on, I think in the 3 Ps, prosecution, protection, and prevention involving education, probably more has gone on in the first 2 Ps. We have lagged around the world when it comes to education and prevention. I think that's starting to change. There's some examples of some incredible programs, including a program out in California that's now spread to 15 cities that focuses on educating men who were convicted of engaging, buying acts of prostitution, educating them on the demeaning effects on women and how they are probably encouraging the demand for trafficking victims. Then there was a question about this policy on how the implication was it was unfortunate that the U.S. government was requiring, when it gave out money, that organizations should oppose sex trafficking and prostitution. Well, I would hope so. If we're going to fight trafficking, we're not going to give money, at least I'm thinking about the programs I have something to do with. We're not going to give money to organizations that are then going to turn around and support trafficking or support prostitution, which fuels the demand for trafficking. It would be absolutely senseless. The last question I want to focus on, and then others are going to comment, there was a question about, what about the rich countries? And I'm going to tell you what I think is a weakness in this report, where it can improve. I think, and it's only been in existence a few years, I think there has not been enough emphasis on rich destination countries. Probably, maybe subconsciously, there was more emphasis on source countries, poorer source countries. And this was discussed at a presidential task force meeting of all the cabinet officers. And the agreement was, and the directive, which I heartily support, that in this coming report we're going to focus more on destination countries and demand. Because as you can tell from this discussion, and we started out saying that this extends to every country in the world. I gave an example from the Netherlands. Extends to the US. I mentioned Japan. It does not just exist in the less developed countries. The less developed countries may be source countries, but as far as I know, every wealthy nation in the world is involved. They're involved maybe not as source countries, as destination countries. And so we have an obligation there, and we have an obligation when we talk about demand when it originates in the destination countries. Sex tourism, child sex tourism, which the president addressed at the UN last year. This is a major component of trafficking. And I've been to places like Chiang Mai in Thailand where this child sex tourism goes on. Thai children, but where do the tourists come from? Yes, some come from Thailand, but they come from Germany, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, United States, Japan, Australia. So here again, the destination countries, or in this case, the sources of demand, we all have an obligation, as the President said at the United Nations, to cooperate in addressing this scourge.
Thank you, Ambassador Miller.
Let me address the questions that relate specifically to what measures can be taken, and is it possible to revise people's thinking? I mean, I don't think anything's impossible. I mean, if you lived through the events of 1989, you've lost the right to say anything's impossible. So we just have to orient ourselves in that way. And fundamentally for the UN, I mean, by the way, it's good to know that there's life after peacekeeping. We all come to Harvard. I say this not without some thought as a Stanford alum. What can be done about sexual exploitation and abuse? A lot can be done. A lot can be done in missions, a lot can be done at headquarters, and a lot can be done by the member states themselves. We can begin by clarifying the code of conduct and eliminating any gaps that exist. We can eliminate the gaps that exist in our rules, and we've discovered that there are some. Certain behaviors that you would think would be standard common practice are not prohibited. For example, having a relationship with someone in your chain of command is not expressly prohibited within the United Nations. We need to close those gaps. We need to take the kinds of measures that enforce curfews, that enforce off-limits areas. When you have sex with a child, it is by definition trafficking, and we need to put it in that context, and we need to get the member states who have national legislation and prosecute for trafficking to take those steps when we have allegations that are substantiated against a service member or a staff member who have engaged in this kind of behavior. Is it possible to revise the MOUs with the member states? Again, anything's possible, including that. Right now, the code of conduct and the standards of conduct that are expected of troops are contained in what are called guidelines for troop contributing countries, which are appended to the memoranda of understanding. We need to make those mandatory. We need to make training mandatory. We have over 40 hours of introductory training for every troop contributing country and every soldier who comes into a peacekeeping mission. We have a number of hours that follow on in terms of reinforcement training once a person is in a mission. These are not mandatory. We need to make them mandatory. We need resourcing for this. We need resourcing for management and resourcing for the kind of follow-on and enforcement that's necessary to have these programs succeed. Is it expensive? I don't know. The United States spent more money in Iraq last year than it has spent on United Nations peacekeeping since 1948. Its annual assessment for UN peacekeeping is less than a week's worth of expenditure in Iraq, less than a week's worth. So we're talking about over 80,000 peacekeepers stationed in 31 plus places around the world who are providing a holding action for the international community to help people and leaders themselves emerge from conflict. This is a problem that we need to deal with, and the member states, I think, are awakening to their responsibilities, including the wealthy ones, and putting together a framework that they can sign up to and move with as the institution gets stronger in peacekeeping.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Hughes.
Okay, one of the things that I wanted to address it has to do with the policy on funds to NGOs, that they are prohibited from using funds to either promote prostitution or promote the legalization of prostitution. And I did research on this, so I know something about this. What we had was public health professionals who got a lot of money to go out and try to stop the spread of AIDS, and that's a good thing. And given how the approach that public health professionals use, they say, we're not going to make a moral judgment on your behavior. All we want you to do is make sure you're safe. Just make sure that you engage in safe sex, use condoms, so forth, and we are not, it's just not our job. We just want people to be safe. We want to stop the spread of AIDS. And that was what they did. And I started looking into trafficking. And of course, I'm concerned about slavery. And I'm concerned about the sexual abuse of women and children. And I'm concerned about exploitation. And what I found as I started digging into this was that I was discovering in some of the most squalid brothels in the world, like Cambodia, that the health professionals were going in and simply getting condoms to enslaved women, to teen girls. And as an effort to try to help prevent the spread of AIDS, they were teaching teen girls, even preteen girls, how to say, please wear a condom in German, Japanese, and English. And I said, this isn't right. And so what we have is we had a clash of public health and anti-trafficking policies. And I think that the policy that has come out that say that organizations cannot promote prostitution and have to make a statement to that is a result of that. And I think that, and one of the problems that we haven't figured out how this is going to work yet, and that is that a lot of the public health workers have to make deals with the brothel keepers. Remember what we said, this is organized crime. These are our traffickers. These are people who enslave women and children every day. As Gary Haugen said in the introductory film, they get up every morning to do their job and to do a good job of enslaving those women and girls. And how is it that if you are you want to do AIDS prevention, how is it you're going to get into that brothel to get access to those women and girls? You have to strike a deal with that enslaver, because he's not going to let you in unless you promise not to ever tell the police or not to do anything contrary to, in any way to interfere with his business. And that's the problem that we're facing. How is it? Believe me, I have absolutely nothing against distribution of condoms or helping anybody. But what are we going to do when we're faced with this contradiction of simply providing services and ignoring the slavery? That's where we're at.
Wow. This is the conundrum, and we often end up very frustrated as a community when we hear these problems and we don't know how immediately to be helpful. But our last speaker at the microphone, Lou Ito, is going to tell us about a group here that you may want to join up with.
Hi, my name is Louie Ito. I'm a sophomore here at the college, and I'm directing a policy group to combat sex trafficking and slavery within the United States. It's a huge problem here. 10,000 women and children are brought into the United States every year. The largest American NGO that combats this problem, Free the Slaves, says the number is as high as 50,000 per year. Sex trafficking has been discovered in all but 4 states, but only 4 states have anti-trafficking legislation. So right now, law enforcement agencies are largely unaware of the problem. There's not very much awareness among the public, and as a result, very few cases have been brought before law enforcement. I believe as of last year, the number was 156 have been brought before the Department of Justice. So this is a group for people, students within the Harvard College, Kennedy School, Law School community. So if you're interested in joining, please email me. My email address is itoh@fas.harvard.edu. We meet Mondays 5 to 6 in room 275 upstairs, and we would love to have you if you're interested.
Thank you. And I assume if they want to come speak to you, you could be over by this wall over here? Great.
Swanee, I know you're going to wrap up. I just have to say one last thing.
Please do. You wrap it.
Because the comment from the Free the Slaves group is appropriate. We started at this point. You know, what can people do? Whether it's helping free the slaves, or in the film International Justice Mission, or many other groups that are involved, talking to local police, to sensitizing them about this issue can be very helpful. Talking in your churches and synagogues in terms of support that can be given abroad or at home, very helpful. All of those things are important, because what we need today is what we had 150 or 170 years ago, when Wilberforce got up in the British Parliament and called for the abolition of the slave trade, and Frederick Douglass and Levi Coffin and Harriet Beecher Stowe led the movement in the United States. We, unfortunately, but in the 21st century, we need a 21st century abolitionist movement. And I hope that everybody here will give a little thought to how they can help finish the job that our ancestors dealt with 150, 160 years ago, but we're back facing it again today.
Yeah, can I add something to that?
If it's rousing.
Yes. Oh, if it's well, yes. And I would just like to follow on that to follow on think global, act locally, because I can guarantee you that there are trafficked women, hundreds of them, within this city. Right here, you know, you don't have to go to Nepal, you don't have to go to Yugoslavia, you don't have to go to the Congo. They're right here. And why is it you're not seeing them? And that's where you have to look inside and say, how have I learned not to see them? And I have a guide that's on my website called Hiding in Plain Sight that talks about how to identify victims. But basically, you've been taught to put blinders on. That that massage parlor, oh, I just don't like it, I'm just going to ignore it. All those ads in all the alternative newspapers and everything that sometimes they even advertise, they've got Russian women or Asian women or Thai women or whatever. Who are those women? And you just sort of read it and keep on going, or maybe you don't like that section of the paper, so you just leaf through it real quick. That's where they are, right there in front of you.
And your website?
I have a card that I can give people and have my website. It's long, I'm sorry. It's the University of Rhode Island. So that's how you can that's how you can get involved. You can get involved right now by going to the town council and saying, what's the Vice Squad doing? Because I can guarantee you the Vice Squad, when they do a raid, they are encountering trafficked women. Guarantee you, because I talk to them.
Madam Chair, I want to impose 30 seconds.
I'm sorry.
General Dallaire. I'm Force Commander.
Of course.
Please.
Please.
I think that the first premise on peacekeepers is the following. There is no such thing as consenting adults in a theater of operations, to start with. And from that premise, the essence of the problem comes from the leadership and the application of leadership by force commanders, SRSGs, force commanders. And because we have such an ad hoc methodology of choosing them, and coming from countries that don't even believe in human rights, let alone the sophistication of the arguments that are here, is that we should not permit force commanders to not be held accountable for what is going on in their command and be relieved of command when they objectively refuse to apply even the rules that they write and sign, as I've seen in a couple missions. Fire and prosecute the force commanders. The leadership will then change the situation on the ground, not the policies as such.
General Dallaire, yours is a voice we should have heard 11 years ago. Yours is a voice that we hear now. You're absolutely right. It's not simply a case of people behaving badly. It's a case of command responsibility and leadership accountability. We're all accountable for what happens on our watch. And this time we're determined to make that change in precisely the directions you're talking about.
Thank you so much. Whoa.